The shriek cut through the palace corridor like a blade. Heavy footsteps pounded against the marble, followed by the unmistakable crash of something breaking, porcelain, maybe, or glass. Catherine's voice, sharp and panicked, echoed off the high ceilings. "Charlotte!" The sound came from the East Gallery, a part of Windsor Castle rarely used except for formal gatherings. When Catherine turned the corner, she froze. Charlotte stood rigid near the tall windows, cheeks flushed, a small tear in her dress. Her eyes burned with a defiance that was both childish and alarmingly adult. Just a few steps away, Camilla loomed, one hand still raised from whatever gesture had made Charlotte recoil. Between them lay a shattered vase, one Catherine recognized immediately as a gift from the late Queen, kept in the family for over a century. For a moment, no one moved. The air felt thick, electric. Then William appeared, drawn by the noise, his expression darkening the instant he took in the scene. He crossed the space in 3 strides, placing himself between his daughter and Camilla. "What happened here?" His voice was low, controlled, but there was an edge to it that made even the footman hovering at the doorway step back. Camilla didn't answer right away. Her gaze flicked from William to Catherine, then back to Charlotte, her lips curling in something halfway between a smile and a sneer. "Perhaps you should ask your daughter," she said finally, the words dripping with implication. Charlotte's chin lifted. "She said I didn't belong here," she blurted out, her voice trembling but steady enough to carry across the room. "She said Mummy and I are just guests." The silence that followed was suffocating. William's jaw tightened. Catherine stepped forward, gently pulling Charlotte behind her, and William turned his full attention on Camilla. Whatever history existed between them, whatever old grudges simmered under the surface, it was all there in his eyes now. If you think the royal family's scandals are all about whispers in hallways and secret letters, think again. Stay with us, because what happened in that gallery didn't just spark a fight, it set off a chain of events that would end with Camilla being banned from royal life forever. Make sure you subscribe, hit the notification bell, and watch until the very end, because this is the moment the monarchy's fragile peace shattered in public view. The aftermath of the gallery scene rippled through the palace like shockwaves. The staff moved carefully, their voices hushed, glances exchanged in corridors. Rumors multiplied by the hour. Some said Charlotte had spoken back to Camilla. Others swore they'd seen Camilla grab the child's wrist when she tried to leave. The truth was known to only a few, and those few understood that speaking of it openly could cost them their positions. William spent the rest of that afternoon in closed-door conversations. Catherine stayed close to Charlotte, guiding her through the usual evening routine as though nothing had happened, but she could feel the tension radiating through the walls. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant door closing seemed heavier, sharper. Camilla, for her part, appeared at dinner that night as though nothing at all had transpired. She wore a string of pearls Catherine had only seen once before, at a particularly frosty state dinner years ago. The choice was deliberate. She smiled at the guests, engaged in polite conversation, but her eyes found Catherine's across the table, holding the gaze for a heartbeat too long. The next morning, the press got wind of an incident at Windsor. No details, just vague murmurs of tension between senior royals. The palace released a brief statement about a private family matter, but by then, speculation was out of control. Every newspaper carried some version of the story, each one inventing new angles. Some painted Charlotte as a spoiled child, others suggested Camilla had lost her temper in a way unbecoming of her role. William did not speak publicly, but privately, he was relentless. Meetings with advisors stretched late into the night. The word overstep was used more than once. He demanded a full account from every staff member who had been anywhere near the East Gallery that day. What he heard was enough to make his decision. It was not the first time Camilla had undermined Catherine, nor the first time she'd been openly dismissive of Charlotte and George. But this was different. This was physical, and in William's eyes, unforgivable. He summoned Camilla to his private study 2 days later. Catherine was present, silent, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Charlotte was not allowed in the room. Camilla arrived with a calmness that bordered on arrogance. "I trust this is important," she said, seating herself without being asked. William's voice was cold as he told her what he'd decided: she would no longer attend private family gatherings. She would be excluded from any event where Charlotte or George were present. In short, she was banned from the spaces that mattered most. For the first time, Camilla's composure faltered. "You think you can erase me?" she asked, her voice dropping. "This isn't about erasing you," William replied. "It's about protecting my children." The days that followed were a study in controlled chaos. Camilla's absence from certain engagements was explained away as schedule conflicts or personal matters. Behind palace doors, the shift was seismic. Catherine noticed the staff moved differently now, more openly loyal to her, less cautious about where their sympathies lay. Charlotte, sensing the change, seemed lighter, more at ease, though she still avoided the East Gallery entirely. Camilla was not the sort to accept defeat quietly. Weeks later, she appeared at a charity event wearing a lioness brooch, a subtle but deliberate signal that Catherine recognized instantly. She was still watching, still present, still dangerous. William noticed too, his smile to the cameras barely hiding a flicker of tension. Soon, the story leaked in fuller form. A palace insider told the press about the vase, the raised voice, and Charlotte's accusation. Headlines were brutal: Queen Consort in palace bust-up, royal rift widens, William's shock ultimatum. Public opinion began to shift, not entirely in Camilla's favor. But what the public didn't know was that this was only the visible crack in a much deeper rift, one rooted in years of quiet resentment that had now fixed its aim on Charlotte. This was not a feud to be smoothed over with polite smiles, it was a wound, and in the royal family, wounds fester in silence until they change history. Even after the ban, the memory of that day lingered, in the way Charlotte glanced over her shoulder in certain halls, in the way Catherine's hand tightened protectively at her daughter's name, and in William's knowledge that he had drawn a line few heirs had dared to draw. The palace adapted slowly, like an old ship catching a new wind. Doors once open now needed knocks, guest lists were rewritten, and invitations quietly dropped a name. Charlotte avoided the east side of the castle, taking longer routes past watchful portraits and chalk-scented classrooms. The gallery vase was repaired in 2 days, it seemed invisible unless you knew where to look. Camilla didn't vanish, but she receded, appearing at select events with flawless poise, the brooch worn just enough to make its point without a word. Behind closed doors, William's advisors spoke in careful terms: protective measures, restoring equilibrium, never ban, which sat too close to exile. The solution was quiet but absolute: Camilla could be everywhere the nation needed her, but never where the children were. Publicly, the family would remain whole; privately, a perimeter had been drawn. Catherine moved as if the perimeter were visible on the floor, a circle of chalk she dared not smudge. She kept Charlotte close without making a display of it. When microphones were near, she smiled and asked after other people's children. When the rooms were empty, she watched shadows in the doorway before letting Charlotte pass. At night she checked the windows twice. The curtains breathed with the weather. The house settled. She didn't. The newspapers circled like winter birds, their headlines first speculative, then hungry, then suddenly righteous. Once an unnamed, senior household source confirmed there had been an incident that required internal adjustment. The tabloids fed on adjectives. The broadsheets fed on the palace's refusal to provide any. Opinion columns turned the family into a metaphor: tradition against reform, matriarch against mother, the brittle past against the soft, stubborn present. A historian on a panel show recalled a century-old quarrel as if it were a prophecy. The host nodded sagely. The ratings were excellent. In Kensington, a box of clippings arrived without a note. It was left on a hall table by a messenger who gave the wrong name and the right smile. Catherine opened it on her desk and found newsprint cut neatly to the edges, the ink smudging faintly on her fingers: the vase, the raised hand, the ultimatum, the lioness. At the bottom of the stack lay a photograph of a different woman in a different decade, standing on a palace step with eyes that did not hide their storms. A corner had been torn away where a second figure had once stood. The tear was as deliberate as a sentence. Catherine closed the lid and slid the box into a drawer she had already learned to lock. William took counsel with men who had written speeches for grief and speeches for victory and knew the difference in weight between the two. This will harden into narrative, one of them said, not unkindly. Ours or hers? William's answer was quiet enough to be mistaken for thought. Then we will choose the children. No one in the room argued with that. Instead they discussed what it meant to choose the children when the nation also required choosing ceremony, choosing continuity, choosing the impossible shadow of a crown that sat on a head even when it wasn't there. The service at St. George's couldn't be postponed, public enough for news, private enough for old tensions. Seating charts were rewritten until Camilla's name landed in a pew that solved nothing. Rain glazed the flagstones that morning as Catherine arrived with Charlotte, William beside them like a man in armor. Inside, candlelight softened the wet light, outside, cameras murmured. Camilla entered without a brooch, the bare lapel its own statement. Her gaze found Charlotte, paused, then moved on. The service passed in measured voices and music that filled what words couldn't. Charlotte's small hand warmed in Catherine's, and she steadied herself on that simple miracle. Afterwards, in the cloister, Camilla slipped a folded card onto a table as she passed. Catherine collected it without breaking stride, opening it later in the car. The seam shows most at dusk. Be ready. That evening, Catherine walked the shadowed corridors to the gallery. The repaired vase caught the fading light, in its reflection, her own face, and in a moment, Charlotte's future. At the far end, Camilla stood, the distance between them speaking more than words. You drew the line, Camilla said at last. You think a line holds. It protects, Catherine answered. Protection and power rarely share a room, Camilla replied. When it breaks again, they'll say it was always weak. It won't break, Catherine said, and walked away before the echo could tell her whether anyone believed her. William had studied the logistics of protection until the maps blurred and the dots became patterns and the patterns began to look like choices. That night he took a red pen and moved 2 bodyguards from a rota no one but he and 3 others ever saw. He changed a door code that had been the same for longer than it should have been. He asked for an audit of keys. He asked for it himself, not through a secretary. He waited for the discomfort to arrive and found that it didn't. The apparatus obeyed the signature on the bottom line. The signature was his. A week later, an editor who had traded in whispers for 3 decades invited himself to lunch with a courtier who preferred his gossip chilled. The editor's questions were clean, almost gracious. He wanted context. He wanted angles. He wanted to know whether a ban was a ban if it had footnotes. The courtier offered him something rarer, boredom. This is a family matter, he said, and smiled in a way that made the editor hungry. The next day the paper ran a piece about new boundaries that reflect modern parenting. It might as well have been a press release. It was not. That was the point. In the smaller rooms the story had a different texture. A member of staff whose mother had polished banisters under a different monarch told a new porter where it was safe to stand when tempers were politely disguised. A nanny who had perfected the art of invisibility stepped slightly into sight so that a child would see her first when she turned a corner. A chef sent up warm milk without being asked the way his predecessor had once sent up a stronger thing for someone who needed it more dangerously. The public calendar demanded its spectacle. Trooping the color arrived with drums that made the pavement thrash. The sky organized itself into straight lines and broken hearts as plain stitched contrails into messages no one could read. On the balcony, colors arranged themselves for history and repetition. Catherine felt the old stone under her heels, the air like a held breath at her back. Charlotte stood in front, eyes bright, chin lifted in a way that had nothing to do with defiance and everything to do with air moving into small lungs. When the crowd roared it sounded like weather. Camilla was not there. The explanation was immaculate, an engagement elsewhere, the kind that could be photographed and never truly remembered. The absence was not immaculate. It poured itself into the space beside William and settled there like a truth wearing a borrowed coat. Camera lenses searched for it, didn't find it, and printed it anyway. After the carriages, after the balcony, after the photographs were taken and the recolorists had what they needed, quiet returned with the stubbornness of an old habit. Catherine took Charlotte's hand and felt the pulse that proved everything at once, that the child was real and present, that the world beyond the gates could be made to blur if you concentrated on a small warm palm. In that exact moment she understood the difference between winning and continuing. The institution prized the first. Families survived by mastering the second. That night, on a table near the window where the lights of the city made the glass into a second, colder sky, lay a velvet-lined case that had arrived by internal post without a signature. Catherine opened it and found a tiara that hadn't been seen in public since before her marriage. It was small by royal standards, delicate in a way that made you look twice to understand why it held. Tucked beneath the silk was a card with 7 words again, but not the same 7, some things hold because someone decides they must. No crest. No mark. Just the sentence, clean as a new seam. She didn't wear the tiara. Not that night. She closed the lid and left it where the city's reflection could claim it. Across the room, William stood with his jacket off, his hands in his pockets, staring at the place on the wall where a portrait had once hung before someone decided to move it for reasons that had nothing to do with light. He turned and met her eyes, and in the quiet there was an agreement so old it had never needed to be spoken. This was not about the weight of metal, it was about the hands that held it steady. Morning arrived like a decision. The press had a new thing to shout about. The old thing had not ended, it had merely learned to speak with a lower voice. Charlotte had arithmetic. William had briefings. Catherine had a visit to a school where small hands made paper crowns and did not know what actual crowns do to necks. In a corridor that smelled of disinfectant and crayons, a little girl asked if princesses get scared. Catherine said, sometimes, with a smile that didn't frighten anyone. Back at the castle, the vase in the gallery took the afternoon light at an angle that made the seam vanish. In that exact moment it looked unbroken, and anyone passing could have believed it had always been whole. It wasn't a lie. It was a version. The palace has always been generous with versions. Dusk came, and with it the hour Camilla had written about in her card. The seam showed again, slender as a whisper. The corridors cooled. Somewhere, a door closed softly and stayed closed. Somewhere else, a lock turned and a key was removed and placed in a pocket that had learned not to jingle. The line William had drawn did not glow, but the feet that mattered felt it under their soles and paused on the safe side. The story, for the time being, held. Not because the past had forgiven the present or because the institution had learned a new language. It held because hands, tired, stubborn, ordinary hands, kept placing the same pieces back on the same shelves every night and checking them again in the morning. It held because a father had said enough and meant it, and because a mother had turned her body into a small wall no one would ever admit they could see. It held because a child slept, and the adults agreed to be the quiet her sleep required. And still, somewhere very near and very far, a brooch lay in a velvet tray waiting for the moment someone would decide to wear it again and change the weather. The palace understood that kind of barometer. It had lived by stranger instruments. The absence on the balcony would have a sequel, all absences do. The line on the floor would be walked by someone with clean shoes and a reason. But not tonight. Tonight, the city pressed its glitter against the windows, the repaired vase kept its shape, the tiara stayed shut in its box like a held breath, and in the space between what had happened and what would happen next, the house settled, and the family, for once, did not. And so the vase stood in its place, the seam glinting faintly in the last light of day, a quiet reminder that some breaks never truly vanish, they simply wait. The palace would carry on, the cameras would smile, and the corridors would whisper their half-truths to anyone brave enough to walk them after dark. But somewhere, just out of sight, the next move was already taking shape. If you want to be here when that move comes, when the seam splits again and the truth spills out, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. Because in this family, every silence hides a story, and the most dangerous ones are the stories we haven't told you yet.